Hi there, my friend.
Hi, Andrea.
Thanks for being back with me again. We've talked several times, and I'm just happy to have you back. There's so many things that you and I could talk about. I just think you are. I love your big brain and your big heart. And but today, we're going to try to stick to the topic at hand. And when I say we, I mean me, which is cultivating a mindful media practice.
Yes.
Yes. So let's just first talk about how and why this topic is interesting to you.
Well, first and foremost, I am a consumer of media. I have social media accounts. I read the news. I also, when I was a little kid, I remember taking like portions of the newspaper when my dad would finish them. Like often I'd read the cartoons in the sports section first and then like eventually get to the front page. So I've always really enjoyed just the process of reading and engaging with current events. And I think at the time I just wanted to feel like kind of grown up about it. And I've lived, like you and I and many people who are going to be listening to or viewing this podcast have lived through a time where there's been huge technological evolution in media and content creation and content consumption. So first and foremost, I like come to this conversation as like a human being who consumes the news. And then during the pandemic, I returned to graduate school, and that's its own kind of long pandemic divine story. But in the process of kind of meditating on what I wanted to write my master's thesis on, landed on the topic of wellness influencers propagating conspiracy theories during the pandemic, a theme and a topic that has become very popular and very like interesting to many people. And I was able to have and apply an academic lens to it, doing both like engaging with a lot of background research in media studies and conspiracy theory research, and kind of the politics of media consumption, and then also kind of this new landscape of academic research, which is really trying to understand disinformation and misinformation, how it spreads across the internet. And so that was a really interesting thing to study, particularly at this time that we're living in. And I'm sure that all of us also as human beings living through a global pandemic and the politics of our day have felt impacted or noticed this in some way or another. And it's become a really kind of popular talking point of its own, which is another interesting facet of it. But in the process of doing that research and kind of, being back in that academic student space, I'm never really far from my yoga practice. And so when I study anything, it's, through a lens of self-reflection. So I was really thinking often through one of my questions to kind of stay grounded in this study, particularly in a time that feels really very like chaotic and full of like existential peril, to come back to the question, like, okay, what is this inviting me to witness? What is this inviting me to witness about myself and my own media habits and my own consumption patterns and my own way of communicating about politics and current events, as well as kind of a larger conversation that I think I'm hoping is more popular these days of us unpacking our own biases and how that shows up and how we engage with information. And so now that I've finished graduate school and I'm kind of thinking about like what to do next, I am motivated to share how I think, or what I've observed, how I think I notice for myself. So much of the advice I'll give in this podcast, I apply first and foremost to myself because I break all of the rules that I suggest all the time. But for all of us to notice and to be aware of how we engage with our phones is changing our minds and impacting our biases in a lot of really subtle ways that we're not always present and aware of and mindful of. And so this is where I think we can apply our our yoga practices, our mindfulness techniques, as we would to our movement practices, or maybe our self-care routines, or how we eat, and the way that we schedule our days, as well to the space of engaging with the news, engaging with social media, and particularly at a time that feels really heavy and confusing and scary for a lot of us, but particularly I think for younger generations who are often shouldering the burden of inheriting a world that does feel like it's teetering on a lot of different brinks.
Yeah. Good way to put it. It's interesting. It's fascinating how quickly the world has changed since smartphones came to be, and also since Instagram came to be, quite frankly. I mean, I say that obviously with my own bias, which is that I use Instagram, so I'm influenced by it. But I was just thinking that I threw a friend a baby shower. And that was the first time I ever used Instagram. And the only reason I used Instagram was because there were filters. I don't think I even knew that it was a sharing platform yet. And that was 10 years ago. Her child is 10 now. So I think about the fact that, like you said, kids coming into the world now, what do they call them? Native users, right? Mm-hmm. This is the world that they know. They don't know another world. You and I were talking before we started about how you used to read the newspaper after your dad was done when you were a kid. I did that with my parents' Newsweek. I loved looking at like the cartoon page, even though probably most of the cartoons went over my head because they were all political. But then I started reading, the columns and the back page. And then I would occasionally kind of get into the actual meaty news. And so the way that everyone is consuming news is so different. And the way that we are just simply interacting with each other is so different. So what you say about treating this like any other practice is really, I like that a lot. And I'm going to start thinking about that more. I feel like I hear a lot of, I'm just deleting Instagram from my phone. And then someone does that for a couple months and then they go back. Right. And so is there a way we can maybe not be all or nothing, but find a balance that starts to work a little bit for us? So where do you begin with that when you think about a mindful daily practice with your phone and your media?
Well, first and foremost, I mean, social media is a really powerful tool, and social media has had a lot of really positive impacts on our national conversation, on our global awareness, and on our politics. I don't know that we get certain, the recent convictions of the murders of Ahmaud Arbery. I don't know that happens without social media, or the attention to the murder of George Floyd. Those are just very recent examples that are very just like top of mind for a lot of folks, right? In some ways, younger people, although their addiction may be more obvious in terms of like hours used, they can be quite sophisticated users because they're sort of more aware of how media is used. And now, like all on, TikTok and what have you, we're seeing the ways that, the war in Ukraine is coming through on TikTok, on Instagram.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't paid attention to TikTok at all with the war, because I'm barely on TikTok. So I didn't even realize that TikTok would allow it, since it's
really quite interesting because we're able to see things as consumers in real time, but we don't often check like, okay, where is this coming from? Who's sharing it? Why? Like all these kind of
is
like
this a clip from 10
questions.
Years ago that someone is saying
is this
just happened?
Exactly. So those kinds of questions I think are also too for native users and younger users. They might be learning, and I know this is happening a lot in public education spaces and private education spaces, and just in school spaces where kids are learning their critical thinking tools and skills that they would have applied to reading, the New York Times or the San Francisco Chronicle, also now to social media. And so they're getting a bigger toolkit, I think, earlier on of how to, be a little bit more, do a little bit more background research before sharing. Now, that's not always true, obviously, but in some cases that's true. So I think first and foremost is I try and again, sometimes I break these rules, but I try to avoid beginning and ending my day with my phone.
That's a hard one.
Which is a hard one. And so it can be just an intention where, just similarly to meditation, of like, okay, I'm going to sit for 3 minutes at the beginning of the day and 3 minutes at the end of the day. Just that conscious, like, flipping off switch. I also try to ritualize my engagement with the news. And so in the morning, I will listen to the news, whether that's like I'm driving to work or I'm on a run or I'm making breakfast or whatever it is. I'm more of a listener and a reader of news than a TV watcher. So I very rarely watch 24-hour news media unless there's a big event that's going on, like the situation in Ukraine or what happened on January 6th, for example. Because I find for my nervous system that feels really overwhelming. And I often notice in those spaces that there's a lot of perspective and opinion that gets layered on top of the news. And there's a way that media's coverage of one story over 2 weeks at a time is really important. Like when there's a big event and a big story, but oftentimes in the slower time, there's this like kind of amping up of emotion around the topic for viewership and for to get people kind of fired up. And the same sort of emotional and entertainment value around current events happens a lot on social media. And there's a lot of tendency for people to share an article or a meme or whatever just based on the headline without seeing where it comes from, without reading the full body of the article. And so I often encourage people to wait to share information online and to first just pause if something is creating an emotional reaction to you, whether that's in a more kind of quote unquote mainstream media source or on social media or some other alternative media source, to just kind of sit with it for a moment and notice when and how those feelings pass. Maybe go for a walk or, sit in meditation, do yoga practice, whatever you have time for, but to create just a little bit of space and separation from your emotional reaction to news content. And ask yourself, like, okay, who's sharing this? What might there be, what's their point of view? Like, what are they trying to get me to believe? And then do I need more information about this topic before I share? Is this person also, I think it's important another question that's really important to think about is like, is this person sharing their lived experience with this? Are they amplifying the people who are most impacted by this issue, this topic or this current event? Or are they just kind of like, pouring gasoline on it, just to kind of inflame tensions, rather than sharing a perspective based on what they've personally experienced. So those are things that are really important. But when you are overwhelmed, to talk to people about your feelings, whether you are in the practice of doing talk therapy or you have a friend that you can, trust, to say, like, I'm really overwhelmed by this topic. I don't know how to feel about it. That just sharing and having conversations is really valuable for processing a lot of the things that we've been dealing with over the last few years and that we see and are constantly inundated with on our phones or however we engage with news media.
So part of what I hear you saying is that if you have like a visceral emotional reaction to something, there are downsides to taking that reaction and then kind of jumping into, whether it's resharing something or commenting or whatever, there are downsides to that. Obviously, there are downsides in the sense that we're just all kind of arguing with each other online, but there are also downsides in terms of your own ability to process the information and actually figure out how you feel about it. So instead of necessarily jumping in whatever form that takes, you take a break and you see how you feel, and or you process it IRL, like you process it in real life, right? I mean, this is what I think is so interesting is that I'm not an internet hater. Like, I think there's so many things that are great about it, including like connecting different groups of people who could never be connected before. I'm thinking specifically of like groups of disabled people, who like couldn't find other people who had their challenges, things like that. And it's clear that if we rely too much on bringing our energy and our emotion and our passion in the online space, like there has to be a balance. We're missing out on the interpersonal interactions.
And I'm really speaking about the immediacy of the emotional reaction, because sometimes when you sit with a story that makes you mad, you stay mad because it's really frustrating, and it's something that you want to get involved with in support and action and finding leaders who are working on that topic that you really care about. That emotional reaction shows that you're a human being who lives in a world that you care about, and that's awesome, right? But it can also be a barrier to finding deeper resources, to learning more, so that when you are in engaged conversation with other people about this thing that you really care about, you're not armed with all the tools of knowledge and resources. And it can lead to burnout, to cynicism, to apathy and inaction, which doesn't really over time yield much progressive and positive action oriented energy towards the change that you might want to see, right? So it's really the immediacy of emotion, not that. I think emotion is a really powerful tool for getting mindful. Okay, like, why is this bothering me so much? Because we can also see that people with media, like, will often, sometimes they'll read a story, or they don't engage with the news as a way of avoiding those big feelings.
Right.
And I don't know of a way to like live in the world right now and not have big feelings about it, because I have big feelings about the things that I engage with in media all the time. But if I want to help other people process it, or in what I view to be a positive, action-oriented way of supporting this issue, I have to sit with how I'm feeling, and then processing those feelings can be a conduit for me towards action. Because at the bottom of those feelings, I often find faith, hope, this like kind of positive, action-oriented power that I'm reminded that I possess, and that all of us possess, particularly when we're able to connect with each other about things that we care about. But if I wallow in abstraction and isolation because I'm overwhelmed with the burden and the heavy weight of all of the challenges that we face, and I'm just kind of living in that space and using my thumbs all day long to share out, people stop listening to me. I get burned out. And I think overall, if we were to measure and balance those actions, there has to be some real world component as well. And media and social media is one tool to raise awareness, but there's a lot of other steps that are required if I'm trying to, change local or statewide or national legislation, for example. And that takes a long time. That takes commitment to us moving with single pointed focus in one direction, right? Rather than just being kind of overwhelmed and like exploding energy everywhere all day long online and I've never seen anyone change their minds. Like, if somebody is listening to this podcast and you have seen someone have their minds changed in the comments section of a social media post, like, definitely send me a DM because I'd be curious to see how that worked out. But I don't see that happening every day, right? I see that happening more over long periods of time where people are engaged in deeper relationship and storytelling with each other or in small groups, right?
Yeah. How do you feel about, thinking about the comment sections and how they can become echo chambers, and how all of us, like, I am including myself in this, like, if we're being really emotionally honest, all of us are attracted to spaces that support our point of view, right? And so they do become echo chambers of our biases and our deeply held beliefs. How do you feel about, like, how much do you feel it's important to broaden your news sources or seeing other points of view, other sides, versus just sticking with what you know and trust?
I think that depends. It depends on like how much bandwidth you have for it, like what your boundaries are. If you can engage with conversation with people who are going to respect your humanity when you show up in that space of like mutual conversation versus like going at it with each other in a debate to prove that I'm right and you're wrong. With differences of opinion when they present themselves, I think that they're a really great opportunity for you to have your perspective broadened and to learn, right? But I live in I've lived in rural spaces most of my life, and so many of my neighbors and much of my family has very different like political opinions to me. And when I engage in conversation with them, I see where there's a lot of mutual frustration and mutual grievance. And so where is our calm and ground in these spaces? But I think that there's a difference between like, I'm going to go like watch Tucker Carlson to get like a different point of view. Like as a social scientist who studies media, I watch Tucker Carlson sometimes to just see how people are engaging with that kind of a personality and what they might be getting out of a personality like his. And then I also engage with like kind of what I would think of as the opposite, like Rachel Maddow or Don Lemon or some of these CNN people that are kind of top of mind to me, or like Anderson Cooper or whatever. And like, how are they different? How are they the same? How might each of these be like talking heads where people go to have their perspective reinforced? You know, I think in many of those spaces, I notice that there isn't a precedence placed on clarity and context, and they often really appeal to people's raw emotion. Yeah. And in some ways, like it's kind of a weaponized critical thinking, quote unquote, like the Tucker Carlsons of the world, who are just asking questions, but they're not asking questions in good faith. They're asking questions and this is actually a term from the Shorenstein Center at Harvard University, talks about a disinformation campaign on the internet. One of them is called Muddying the Waters, where the project is to just create just enough confusion and chaos to amplify and to give your point of view more power. And I think all of us are probably familiar with, at some point in our life, maybe in a school context, or we have a friend like this who's like just always plays devil's advocate, even if it's like for something that is pretty bizarrely and obviously wrong, like Nazism. It's like, wait, we don't need both sides of this thing, man. You know? So I think I think it really depends. And then also using like, but if you are in real relationship face to face with someone and you feel like your safety is intact and your mental health is intact, and you have the energy to engage and ask them questions about a lot of how questions. I find how questions to be more productive than why questions, because the how question goes to the process. Okay, like, you know, how did you get to this conclusion? Like, walk me through some of the steps that led you to this place. And in those stages, maybe I can say, okay, well, that's really interesting. I see you here. I've noticed this here. I can connect with you here, but this is where we have a difference. And here's where I'm coming from my perspective and how I arrived at this place. So in that way, I'm able to kind of show my lived experience with something. I'm able to share my expertise with something without it being felt like a personal attack against that other person, right? Because I think there's this tendency that it's really difficult for people to engage with current events and not mirror it back to like, oh, because this is true, that makes me a bad person, right? This is like, I think this happens a lot in white America, to be honest, of like, if this is true about our history, then everyone's calling me a terrible person, rather than having like a little bit of space.
So you're saying people get really defensive.
Get really defensive.
Yeah.
And so what are the ways that I can diffuse that by asking people the hows and the whats of how they arrived at, the place that they're in right now, cognitively, emotionally, and even spiritually, and walking me through that process. I found a lot more productivity in that space. And this is really a lifetime trial and error process where, I got into a lot of debates with my family members in my teens and my 20s and throughout this pandemic. I think I've become more sophisticated in communicating, particularly given the study that I was in, and then trying to apply some of these tools based on like, okay, this is what I'm noticing about our habits and social media. And, how can I put that in practice in conversation? And it's not going to work 100% of the time because all people are different. And there's often going to be a range of people who are, just sort of like live in a more hostile, defensive, emotionally guarded place. And then people who are just more open, or you have a relationship that's built on some other thing, right? Trust, or, with your neighbors, for example, where you can have those conversations and it doesn't feel so aggressive because your relationship is built on a foundation where they know that you care about them and you know that they care about you. And so there's mutual trust and admiration in those spaces. It has required me in the past to kind of take a little step back from my own ego and need to be right, and to live more in the space of where I'm not really that concerned if this person thinks that I'm right, because that's not why I'm having this conversation with them. I'm curious about their processing of the world and trying to understand how they see the world and what their struggles might be that led them to this point, right? If it's financial or health or whatever it might be, and then finding ways to support them in those spaces as well.
You said so many things that made me go to so many different places, but I will say that, yes, I mean, one thing for us to recognize is that news has changed so much. I can remember my dad. As a kid, my dad would come home from work. He just had like 9 to 5 job, and he would turn on the nightly news at 6 o'clock. And sometimes he would make us, like, he would leave it on while we had dinner, much to my mother's chagrin. But whatever, from 6 to 6:30, he watched the news, and that was that. And that was the end of the day. And Walter Cronkite or Tom Brokaw or Peter Jennings or whoever it was stood there, sat there and read the news. Now, I know they had their biases, but still, it wasn't full opinion-based news shows, which is what Don Lemon and what Tucker Carlson, like, let's just be honest, both of them, that's what they are. The eye rolling out of today's, hosts, just that alone to me speaks volumes about like how they're reporting the news. So I think, for people to be aware that there's a difference between trying to get as fact-based as you can in the moment and, let's say, report on a war that's happening versus, like you said, just asking questions and rolling your eyes. Like, those are two very different forms of media.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to bring up another layer of this, is that the reason that those shows continue to get more primetime slots is because they're the most popular. And so it also is It's something that requires us to take a step back and notice our base habits and instincts. We like drama.
Yes.
We gravitate towards sensation without context. It takes a lot of time to take a step back, to either be a conscious listener of someone's lived experience that's different than yours without feeling it like a personal attack, or to take the time to be really well educated on the topic. We see people who are influencers who are all of a sudden becoming like, amateur epidemiologists during a global pandemic. And now today they're all of a sudden, like, they may have just learned where Russia and Ukraine were like 2 weeks ago and are now experts on the topic and sharing about it often on their pages. The most popular podcast in the country is also the most popular like news show, quote unquote, in the country, which is Joe Rogan, who got into a lot of trouble recently because he often shares and brings on people who are just asking questions, quote unquote, about the pandemic without having the bulk of the scientific community there as a counterpoint, right? Because he's the outsider, the alternative media, even though he has the largest contract and the most listeners, right? So it does require us to kind of reconsider some things, like what is mainstream media? What are we most attracted to when we're engaging with media? Who do we follow? Why do we follow them? What are we getting out of being in that space? And I think what's really interesting about Instagram in particular, and is also sort of true, I think, of TikTok, though I haven't investigated that space quite as much. Instagram was more of my platform for research. But many of us log on to social media to be entertained.
Right.
And the Pew Research Center has conducted lots of different, like, small scale and larger scale research on, people's kind of changing and shifting opinions of what the news is. And in the last few years, people have started to understand that Facebook and Twitter are kind of how they get the news. But as recently as the pandemic, most people who engaged with Instagram did not say that they received news on Instagram, which makes me feel like, and I have the theory that because it's this kind of quote unquote, like mindless entertainment space, but there's a lot of messaging about current events and politics in the world that gets pulled into the nice graphics of Instagram and kind of the influencer culture, where we develop relationships of trust with people that we follow online all the time. Like, we know what time they get up in the morning. We know what they eat for breakfast. We know what they think about the world. We know how they exercise in the morning. We know what they wear every day. And we learn, the way that human beings learn are in relationships of social trust. And those are also the spaces where we can be most subtly or overtly misled or misguided. Mm-hmm. And it really does require us to kind of take a step back and say, okay, if I'm aware that if there is a data point that's been replicated over and over again, that misinformation spreads 5 to 7 times faster on the internet than actual objective fact, what does that say about me as a social media user? If I know that the most viral content on social media is kind of extreme, emotional, not context layered, not nuanced, entertainment kind of content, what does that say about me as a social media user? And all of these larger companies over time, like, they're creating algorithms that are boosting back to us information that's going to keep us on those platforms for as long as possible. And so it becomes harder and harder and harder over time as these algorithms better and better and better understand us cognitively and emotionally, for us to be mindful and interrupt those patterns. Mm-hmm. And so it really takes an effort. Mm-hmm. And I understand that the impulse to just be like, I don't want to be a part of this. And I've wrestled with that myself, right? And maybe in the future I'll just give it up. I don't know. Who knows? But I do think as well, and I've seen a lot of people use social media really well to share their stories and make really meaningful and beautiful content. And so I don't think it's this like good or bad thing, nor is it necessarily even a new problem. I think that it's just our human tendency over time. But in a new space, and it's in a space where everything is amplified. So things get spread faster, farther, than ever before. Yeah. And a lot of those like kind of fact checking mechanisms themselves, like people are suspicious of, A, and B, they rarely reach the person who's been manipulated by that content of misinformation or even a disinformation campaign. It's almost never that messaging goes back to where they're engaging with something that is factual or research based. And the other part of it is that storytelling is really powerful and is a tool by which, and probably the most powerful tool by which people have their minds and their perspectives changed, or their opinions sort of shifted out of something that's super solid towards something that's more open and expansive and can take in lots of different points of view without putting up a barrier or a shield and to contract against, right? So storytelling is incredibly powerful. And in many ways, I think it's the most powerful tool to human advancement and progress. So it's kind of this double-edged sword. And again, like, I think I'm not alone. There are a lot of people in many, many different spaces of the academic world, but also online as well, that are trying to help people just process and navigate these new spaces. But yeah, I mean, there are people making a lot of money off of us fighting with each other online. So that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, you and I talked last time about, I'm just keep going back to this idea of opinion-based media versus straight up news, as straight up as it can get, and just how, like, even the difference between reading the newspaper, where it will be tagged opinion at the top of a column, versus, in the world today, makes it so much easier than navigating, just listening, right? So yeah.
I think reading and listening both are a much slower processing part of our cognitive wiring. And in that way, it can help us to take our time with the news, notice when we need to take breaks or we're getting fatigued. So I try to do as much as I can. Unfortunately, I can't, where I live, I can't get a newspaper anymore. I wish that I could. Oh, wow. I'm just too far out. So there's no newspaper delivery out here, but to engage at a slower pace as much as possible. The other thing about social media is that it's very short and repetitive. So I think it creates an illusion of being well-informed because you're engaging with a large volume of content, but you don't necessarily have in that reading or in that consumption a larger, a history from which the story is coming to us from, some of that backstory, some additional perspectives in interview that are often seen. So in many like longer form articles, you'll hear about people's lived experience through direct source quoting. There's a lot of citation of sources. Sometimes there will be additional resources for understanding. When in social media, that is not always the case. It's sometimes the case, but it's rarely the case. And we're kind of scrolling in this fast-paced way. And there's that, the adage of doom scrolling, where I don't think we're getting really well informed about the thing that we care about that's going on in the world. And we're kind of marinating in just heavy stuff, and not realizing how long we are on that space. Like if I'm reading an article, I'm reading the article, and when I'm done reading the article, I'm done. I might move on to another article, but if it's a longer form article and it's taken me like 45 minutes to read, I might have more of an impulse to put my phone down. Where if I'm engaging with content that's 30 seconds long, a minute long, 2 minutes long, over and over and over again, I think a lot of us have experienced this thing where we're like, oh my gosh, I've been on my phone for like 2.5 hours, like looking through all this pandemic content or looking through war content, or seeing picture after picture after picture of a war zone, which is an important phase of understanding media. But at the same time, it can really make us feel powerless. And the feelings of cynicism, apathy, powerlessness often get kind of reused by the same people who are perpetuating some of the most evil in the world. They are the tools of autocracy. They are the tools of tyranny. And so what are the practices that help us to stay engaged and informed, but also where our baseline is reminding us that we are powerful, we are resilient, and that underneath the net of the doom, that we have faith in ourselves, faith in one another. And like, what is the bigger vision that we hold for this space, this world? Like how do we want to commit our energy here in our time here? And it's also kind of inspiring, to see when people do stand up, when people do over many, and this happens a lot on social media too, where activists have really used the space to inspire people to get involved with their local communities. I often encourage people to stay engaged with at least one news source that is local. I know it's getting harder and harder to find a local newspaper, but if you can find one, they often do have some subscription that you can get onto your phone or apps on your phone. So I try to have one here that's just like Marin and Sonoma County based. Those are the counties that I live in between, as well as the San Francisco Chronicle, as well as the New York Times. And because I have the resource to pay for those subscriptions, I really find it's important to support, not just in my eyes and my ears, but financially, these organizations that are doing a good job of trying to tell bigger stories with as much clarity and context over longer periods of time, that are slower pace, to help us navigate and make actionable and skillful choices in our lives and in the world.
I think that's probably a good stopping place for us.
Yeah.
I think you shared a lot of really good thoughts, and I think, like you said, if you are at the point where you're doom scrolling, instead of the turning away and being like, I can't do this anymore. I can't look at the news. I can't handle it. You can go to a slower form of news. You can go to an actual newspaper, or you can go to a longer form and allow yourself to get more context, allow yourself to maybe take something in that doesn't evoke such an emotional response, but just gives you more of the background of where we are right now. And take that route, or even take a short break and decide to come back. Yeah,
on my website, I have a lot of just tips for folks to take or leave. I do think it's kind of a choose your own adventure with media. And so experimenting and finding ways to engage with the news daily or weekly that makes sense to you. And then also taking scheduled breaks, whether that's one day a week or a week out of a month or whatever it might be, whatever fits into your life, into your schedule best, to disengage from all media, and to really, as yoga practitioners, and this is, a bulk of your listeners, right? Where this is a podcast about yoga. And so it's important for us, and I know it can be really challenging sometimes, but to stay disciplined and dedicated to the practices that make us feel balanced, well, reasonable, sane, somewhat able to stay grounded in a world that is inevitably mitigated by chance and human error and has a lot of chaos. Like that is a part of, in the yoga teachings in the Vedas, like Maya this is the theater. It's kind of supposed to be like this there, and our job, I think, or our task as practitioners is to find daily check-ins where we're self-reflecting and connecting to our inner reserves of strength and contentment and ease and well-being, and then sharing those tools with others as often as we can so that everyone has the access to wellness in some whatever way works best for them, so they can feel similarly connected at some point in their day to a larger sense of peace and faith in themselves and all of us and each other, and to stay connected to that as often as possible. And that could be like, connecting with your friends, talking to people. I saw a resource from NPR just the other day, actually on social media, on their social media page, that I thought was so relevant for adults as well. But it was like how to help kids when the news is scary. And it was, comments like helping kids to process through art and play and saying things like, I don't know, if they ask big questions that you don't know the answer to, and finding ways to look for leaders and engage in action, and all of these things that help us to stay connected to our purpose and to our mission. Because the news can be overwhelming and it can destabilize us to where we feel cynical and hopeless.
Yeah.
And I think that's why creating some sort of like ritual around your day where you're really mindful and intentional about, okay, I'm going to engage with this at this time of the day, whether it's the morning or the afternoon, or for me, I engage with listening in the morning and reading in the afternoon, particularly if there's a story that I heard in the morning that I found really interesting, or there's a big thing going on in the world, like right now, that I want to get more updates on and stay more engaged on.
Mm-hmm. Cool. I will put links to your website because you have a blog and you have a lot of really great resources there. So I will definitely put links to that on the show notes. And thank you so much. Thanks for being here, Melissa.
Thanks, Andrea. Good luck out there, everybody. I know it's hard.
Exactly.
All right.